Hello and welcome to Early Childhood Ireland's podcast, which features interviews and discussions on all issues relating to high quality in the early years and school age care sector. In our episodes, we have a range of speakers who are leaders in the areas that matter to Early Childhood Ireland members. This podcast series is proudly supported by Aricus Insurance, which offers a comprehensive range of cover at discounted premiums for both business and personal insurance products, so visit www.aricus.ie for more information. I'm Maura Corbett and I work with Early Childhood Ireland. Early Childhood Ireland members will know that the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights has released a call for submissions, including submissions from children, about an optional protocol to the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. The proposal for the optional protocol is to explicitly recognise that the right to education includes early childhood care and education, and explicitly state that with a view to achieving the right to education, that states shall make public pre-primary education available free to all, beginning with at least a year. So the proposal is that this would be enshrined in the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. So to chat about why it's important to consult with children, including babies and toddlers, I'm really delighted to have Professor Deirdre Horgan from University College Cork with me today. Deirdre's a Professor of Education of Early Years and Childhood Studies in the School of Education in UCC. Her research and teaching interests include childhood, child welfare and protection, children's rights, participation and citizenship, policy and practice responses to child migration, and she recently completed a literature review on methodologies for consulting with children from birth to 5 years with Hub na Nóg to inform the development of the guidance and a tool for consulting with babies and children aged birth to 5. And she's currently working on a literature review on participation mechanisms for children aged 6 to 12. Deirdre, such an important area. You're so welcome. Thank you.
Delighted that you invited me, and I'm always happy to talk about child participation. It doesn't feel like it's a lot of work for me because it's a passion of mine. It's something I've been working on for so long. Yeah.
So I suppose we've mentioned in our weekly e-zine about the Hub na Nóg toolkit, and we'll come back and talk a little bit more about that in a second. But just to kind of set the scene for the area of consulting with children, can you tell us about your work and involvement with Hub na Nóg, Deirdre?
Sure, delighted to. So I suppose, as you say, Maura, my background is, I suppose, quite a lot of my work has been focused on child participation, children's citizenship in a range of contexts and across the span of childhood, really, including early years. And I have a particular focus in my research on marginalised children, including migrant children, children with disabilities. So I suppose I've reported on a number of consultations with children by various government departments over the years, the Departments of Children, Department of Health, Department of Education, so that these consultations would inform policy. So we've reported on consultations to inform the National Obesity Plan. So we did a healthy lifestyles consultation with children to inform that plan. We did consultations and reported on them on children's views on after school care. And more recently, as you say, I reported on a lit review really for the informing the toolkit for including children in participation in early years from birth to 5. So I suppose that's, a lot of the practice and policy oriented work. But I suppose I've been involved with the Children's Research Network in their child participation special interest group. I co-edited a book with Danielle Kennan from UCG on children's participation in policy, practice and research in the Irish context. So, and I've written a number of peer-reviewed journal articles around child participation. I think one of the most maybe important and maybe most cited of those journal articles was in relation to, I suppose, just the conceptualization of child participation, why it's important, how it benefits children, and also some of the key challenges associated with practicing in a participatory way with children. So that was, gosh, that was over a decade ago now, in the Childhood Journal. But that, I suppose that's a synopsis. My background actually is social policy, always with a focus on childhood, and my PhD research was around child welfare and protection, and the need for interdisciplinary collaboration between Gardaí and social workers in the area of child sexual abuse. So, you know, I've always been interested in researching on the areas of childhood, but not particularly from an early years perspective. So I suppose that's my background and how I came into this space.
And I think it's the whole area of participation and consulting, it's so interesting. It's from birth to 5, because maybe in the past, and we were chatting a little bit before I hit record about that we think older children are perfectly capable of expressing their view. But sometimes people might think, well, children under 5, particularly children under 2 or 3, they mightn't have the words yet to be able to say, I want, or I like, or I don't like, or whatever. But that, if we use a range of tools, we can. And I suppose one of the key pieces of research that underpins some of this is the Lundy model. So could you remind us a little bit of the work of Laura Lundy, and what it means in terms of child participation?
Sure. And I totally agree with your point that, it's about embedding the skills and the capacities that, that in an early age in children. So there are so many benefits that we know from, all of the research internationally about the value of child participation. We know how children build capacity and build their relationships, build their skills, build their confidence, and become good future citizens as well as current citizens. Because I'm very opposed to this view of, this future oriented view of childhood. Let's develop children, let's make them good citizens for the future. It's about them being good citizens now, because they are equal citizens. So I suppose that brings us back to Lundy, and the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child has been really, I think, the catalyst for all of this focus on child participation, even though, interestingly enough, participation is not mentioned in the UN CRC in Article 12. It's really interesting that it doesn't really define the concept of participation at all. It doesn't mention the word participation rights of the child in any particular article, but the UN CRC has become synonymous with participation. And I think so that was really a kind of a watershed moment in a way. It's in Ireland and internationally, in terms of bringing about all of this development of participation policy, guidance for practitioners working with children, etc. And I think like we've many models of child participation. We've Hart's ladder of participation, we've Shear's pathways to participation. And in 2007, Laura Lundy wrote an article based on her work on children's participation in education contexts. The article was titled Voice is Not Enough. And I think that really formed the foundation of a lot of our policy in Ireland. It underpins our national strategy on children's participation that was published in 2015. It underpins the participation framework that was published in 2021. And I suppose she conceptualizes child participation as rights-based. She's a lawyer, so she focuses and conceptualizes child participation as rights-based, and she identifies 4 key elements to ensure participation in accordance with Article 12, the participation article in the UNCRC. And those 4 elements are space, voice, audience, and influence. So in other words, we need to create spaces where children feel comfortable, feel trusted, feel respected, feel heard. We need to ensure that children are given the voice And I think sometimes voice in the UNCRC has been problematic. Use of the word voice in relation to participation generally I find is problematic, because it assumes the verbal child. And in many ways, that tends to lead us to exclude in our mind pre-verbal children, non-verbal children, and it can marginalize. There's that risk of marginalize. And I think within the UNCRC and Article 12, there's almost a conditionality of participation based on age and maturity levels, that's been assumed, and that's quite contentious. And I think the committee subsequently wrote a comment on Article 12 where they elaborated on that. And the thinking has developed quite a bit since the UNCRC was developed back in 1989. So really, I suppose what we now know is that participation refers to all children across all age groups, across all capacities and abilities. Children who are citizens of a country or who are migrants and asylum seekers in a country, regardless. And it's the responsibility of adults to ensure that that participation by those children happens. So that voice piece, I think, is really interesting. And I think Laura herself has commented on the conceptualization of voice even within her own formula. And the other pieces then to ensure participation within Laura's model are audience and influence. There's no point in the child expressing an opinion or showing a preference or making a decision if there isn't an audience to hear and respond to that and ensure that that decision or that view of the child has some influence. And I think we understand now that it's not, child participation doesn't mean that when a child expresses a preference that will always happen or makes a decision that will always be followed through, but that the adults in the room hear that child and respond to that child. And if a certain action can't be taken, that it will be explained. There's a rationale as to why certain decisions can or cannot be taken and followed through on. So Laura Lundy has, in her model, that's evolved over the years. And as I say, it underpins our own national strategy, our action plan on children's participation. But in 2021, there was a participation framework published, which is really important, I think, for practitioners. And there's some really important guidance and some case studies in there. And in many ways, I see that as the launch pad for this toolkit now for birth to 5. Which she talks there
at that time, sorry to cut across you, Deirdre. In fact, at that time, we did a podcast with Laura Lundy and Anne O'Donnell about that participation framework. So I can put the link to that in the notes so people can listen back to that.
Yeah, so in that, I'm sure Laura and Anne would have talked about participation with purpose. So the idea that children or young people involved in decision making have their views heard, they're taken seriously, and their views are given due weight. So I think that embedded that principle of, due weight and listening to children with purpose, with a purpose to do something about what they say. So I suppose that brings us back. I can talk a little bit about the lit review, if you like. And
that sounds good. I'm really glad that you spoke about voice and that broad interpretation of voice, that it isn't just verbal voice, because there's so many other ways of making your thoughts known when you're open to seeing those. So thank you. Really appreciate you taking the time to tease that out a little bit. So can you talk us through some of the findings of the lit review, please? That'd be great.
Sure. And I think probably why the Department of Children and Hope and Know pursued this is because maybe many sectors, and particularly many practitioners within the early years sector, may have felt a little challenged around how do we operationalize this? Like, this is a model, this is a very, they're on board with the principles underpinning participation. They want to do it, but they want some support around how to do that. So essentially the department was anxious to ensure that any guidance or any toolkit was going to be evidence-based. I suppose there were a number of key developments in leading up to this. So the department set up an early years working group. This group commissioned a literature review, and they also commissioned case studies to be developed to inform the development eventually then of a toolkit for practitioners, which was published just a couple of months ago. Alongside that, and we've been just talking about this before starting the recording, Maura, essentially, you know, in the last couple of years, there's been such momentum around this area of young children's participation in the Irish context. And I think we're really leading the way in many respects in this regard. So the NCCA has updated ASHTR. There's this very central focus on children as global agentic citizens. You know, the lit review, the consultation with babies, toddlers and young children, all informing that updated ASHTR, has central to its theme child participation. So I think all of that kind of has aligned in the last 2 to 3 years to give us this really important body of work around why it's important to do child participation, and also hopefully helping us in terms of how we practice, you know, how we do that in practice in direct work with young children. So the lit review that I undertook was commissioned by Department and Hub and Oak. And what they wanted was to identify, explore and map contemporary research on the participation of our youngest citizens aged birth to 5, and to identify potential areas for the development of a toolkit. So all the way through developing the lit review, I met with the working group, and they advised, they supported the direction of it, and also took on board the key findings and some of the key themes as they were emerging from the lit review, and that helped to inform the development of the case studies and obviously later on the toolkit. And I think what's interesting is when I started to look at the research, although you and I were speaking about this to say, in early years, this sector has been leading the way in participatory work with children, in centering children as capable, as, social actors who had lots of capacities. At the same time, when you look for research around this space, it's quite limited. And so Correa et al. In 2019 stated that there was no systematic review. Looking internationally, they found no systematic review on young children's right to participate in early year settings. So their systematic review in 2019 then only focuses on 3 to 6 year olds, so doesn't include the birth to 2 age group. So I found it really interesting that even in recent years, there hasn't been a strong focus on birth to 5 year olds in child participation research. So we've talked about the voice and the focus on voice and how problematic that has been. And in many ways, maybe that has been part of the reason why there hasn't been such a focus in research on supporting very young children's participation. So the aim of the lit review was to do that, to go right back to birth and include all children up to 5 years of age, and try to synthesize any of the existing research in the field to help us develop a better understanding and scope current thinking and provide an evidence base for the toolkit. And I suppose looking at the research that is there, although limited, there is a strong conceptual basis on sociocultural theories of childhood. And very much rights-based models of participation, such as Lundy's model. And the review draws on all that current work in Ireland that I mentioned. So the updated ASHTR, the lit review that informed it, the consultation with children that informed it. So it's a very rich space now in the Irish context. And I think we have so much important work in the last 3 to 5 years.
And hopefully this will trigger research. When I was doing my master's back a while ago, one of the schools of thought when we were picking dissertation topics, and in academia, yes, you'll be well familiar with this, was kind of choose something that there's been research on before, yes, so you have something to draw, yes, on and refer to. So someone has to start somewhere. So even though you found there was very little research, hopefully this will trigger more, because now there's another body of work to draw on that, like you say, has synthesized the previous work, and that hopefully, like you said, that in the past 5, 10 years, the idea of child participation has gained momentum in practice. Hopefully, you know, the research will kind of follow it up, and it'll continue to feed kind of one into
and
the other.
we're already seeing it in our undergraduate program here at UCC. Our fourth year students do a final year project, and you actually could see the strand of participation running through a number of those projects. So they're being exposed to more lectures, they're being exposed to more material, more of the research, more of the current thinking around child participation in early years. So we had some amazing kind of research projects on risky play and how practitioners can support and promote and facilitate risky play in a very participatory way with children, and just supporting their views, their decisions in early years contexts across a range of topics. So yeah, I think it's our new graduates coming through who are being exposed to this that hopefully will impact the sector as well.
Yeah, and stay in the sector, as we've,
and
you know, as there have been so many discussions about. So, you know, and I think that's, I mean, to me, that's the way research and practice should be, is that they feed one into the other, that they're not two, you know, kind of separate silos, that the research is here completely alienated from practice, because it doesn't support the development of practice in any field, not just early years education. So you mentioned the idea of you know, operationalizing it. So can you share some of your thoughts on that aspect, so that, you know, real children in real settings are involved, consulted with, and can participate?
Great, Maura. Yeah, so I can, and I suppose the literature that is there tells us that very young children can and do make decisions, and they can express choices, and they can make wise choices. And really, the responsibility is on us as adults to facilitate that. And I think that's the key message I would make to any practitioners who are listening to this, is that we have the skills as early years practitioners. We have the ability to work with young children. So we have many of the skills that are needed already. It's just about really promoting that awareness about the importance of why we're doing this. So we know, for example, the benefits for children. We know that if we embed child participation in our practice, it makes for children that are happier, that feel more respected. It affirms children as experts in their own lives, who know best about what they want, what they like, what they dislike. It ensures that we have better services, you know, as early years providers, that we are actually providing the service that children want and responding to children in the ways they want. It helps, particularly, we know this from the research, it benefits specific groups of children, like it benefits all children, but it particularly benefits specific groups who have been marginalized, who have been disadvantaged: refugee children, traveler children, children with disabilities, children in poverty. They gain far more from that participatory relationship in early year settings than children in general do. So it's really important that we engage in this way with children to promote their self-confidence, their sense of being partners with adults, their self-esteem, their teamwork, their problem solving, all of that. So that's, I suppose, that's the launch pad really for practitioners, is to understand why we're doing it, why it's so important, how it benefits not just the children, but themselves and the sector and, you know, the setting. And I suppose if I was to talk about some of the key findings, I would say, through the literature review, I identified some key areas where participation can take place, and you know, the key thematic areas where it can really be impactful. So some of the areas, I think there's about 6 or 7 areas. They include things like children's participation around their care needs, around the physical space that they're in, and how it's designed and flexible and alterable to their needs. Friendships, how they're formed, how children can make choices around friendships, how those ideas can change over time, how adults often need to just step back and just help to facilitate that, but give children space. Curriculum, children can be very involved and participate in designing and developing and making choices about activities and curricular decisions. Transitions, like horizontal and vertical. So children make transitions on a daily basis, between activities, going and coming from the setting, but also the important kind of vertical transitions into preschool and out of preschool to primary school. Children have important things to say and important choices to make in all of those transitions. And then things like policies and documentation, we have really good examples in the literature of where children make decisions about, codes of behavior around things like early reading policies. Some fantastic examples. There's a British project, Look Who's Talking, and Cassidy et al. Have written extensively about that project. And there's many others, but in the UK context, that I think has been quite an important one. Documentation, so children can be included in documentation. So things like Wall et al. Talk about projects where there's an electronic journaling and there's an app where families get access to activities and things that children have produced in the course of the day or the week. And children can make decisions about what to upload, what not to upload, what they want to share with their families, what they don't want to share. So very basic things like that. And if you go right back to the babies, around the care needs, for example, and we were talking about this before we started recording, it's everyday decisions that children are making about eating, resting, sleeping, toileting, changing, all of those things. For babies who are pre-verbal, facial expressions, as you say, clamping of the mouth. We were talking about feeding and when children want to eat or don't want to eat, or particular foods they don't want to eat. Use of pointing, the gaze, and where children are looking and where they're focusing on their interest on. All of these are key indicators. And as early years practitioners, we're trained to understand, to observe, to build relationships with. So it's really just building on that practice orientation that we already have.
I think you make that point really well about, and when you said about the documentation, I smiled because it brought me right back to being in a setting when I was involved in the Ashler in Action initiative between Early Childhood Ireland and NCCA. And we were, doing some videoing and talking about documentation and so on. And purely for the purposes of having a quieter background, a key worker brought her children into a room that was empty with some photos that had been printed. It was before the digital documentation became as common as it is now. And she had a wallet of photographs that were printed and just asked the children which photos they wanted to put in their journal. And the richness of the stories that were told when the children, everybody was blown away. It was like magic, I'm choosing that picture or put that picture in, and the memories the child had maybe about, the day it was taken. Wouldn't have been that long ago, but the thoughts it triggered, and, it was amazing. And it was just, that bit of tuning in, and I suppose recognizing how much consultation you do. I think maybe when we put a label like consultation on something, you think of, the way we more formal focus groupsy kind of thing. But we're consulting with children an awful lot of the time, and maybe, tuning into that and recording it and documenting it as such.
Absolutely. And I suppose I totally agree with you, Maura. Like it's happening, people are doing it as part of their everyday practice. But I suppose it's about being more aware of it. And as you say, recognizing that, promoting it in other practitioners, and as a setting, within one setting, if there's a team meeting, that every so often there's a focus on participation, or there's a kind of, it's on the agenda. How can we improve that? How can we ensure children are more centrally involved in that? And I suppose a lot of the literature would tell us the best type environment for this is following a slow relational pedagogy. So if you've got that pedagogy in place and embedded in your practice anyway, it's likely that, all of this is happening. But it's about, I suppose, being more purposeful about it. One of my PhD students is actually doing her research on how current kind of regulatory restrictions and all of the obligations around, reporting and the level of administration that's required now by early years settings, how that is impacting on participatory practice. And it's really interesting what she's finding, that it can sort of, in a way, it can reduce the level of space and time for those creative and participatory moments. Like you're talking about your colleague who took them to a room and looked through the photos and spent that time. More and more, I think early years practice is becoming more regulated, more scheduled, lot of responsibilities to lots of different agencies. So I think we need to be careful and we need to protect what we have, because early years has led the way in terms of this kind of pedagogical approach with children. Primary school sector is looking to us, other sectors are looking to us to try to emulate what we do. So we've really got to protect what we have.
Yeah, I think, regulation has played a huge role in improving quality, ensuring that children are in, safe, good environments. But certainly the admin overload can be in all kinds of ways. I think not just in our sector, it can be, across the board that paperwork is necessary, but, not to the detriment of the quality and the, the time that children have. It's so important. So Deirdre, I know you're not kind of involved in this specific consultation on the optional protocol to the Convention on the Rights of the Child, but before we wrap up, have you anything you'd like to say about it?
I think it's essential. I think it's a really important issue. I think the UN has this call, which I think is closing soon, isn't it, Maura?
It is, yeah.
So I think
the 8th of June for children's consultations. But we have the right dates on our e-zine, so we'll ensure that they're out there.
Yeah, so that idea, I think, just as a fundamental right for children to have access to free, universal, early education is critical. And we see how education has become quite precarious. When we look globally at issues around second level education, even, access to primary education, we look at kind of global conflict, we look at, countries in the global south, but also countries in Europe where there's conflict ongoing, and the risk, and one of the primary risks to children, other than, poverty and lack of nutrition, is this lack of the basic access to education. So I think it's never been more important than it actually is right now. And I think Ireland in many ways has a very good context and has a very good recent history on this in terms of the early childhood care and education scheme, the right to 2 years free preschool and early education for children, and the take-up level is extremely high in the Irish context compared to other countries which have comparable schemes like France. So we have much higher take-up rate of those schemes in Ireland. But embedding it as a right is so important. It goes back to what we were talking about all along here, Maura, that if it's not rights-based, then it becomes very precarious. And if budgetary situations change, if there's a recessionary cycle, then what happens with our scheme? So if it's not embedded and if it's not recognized as a right and it's not within the UN convention, then it becomes more precarious. So I think we've got to understand the importance of this, and also linking in with consulting with children. I think if you'd ask any children in early year settings, they would say they want to be there. They
Yeah.
enjoy spending time with their friends. They build very important relationships with adults. I know from my own children, they still talk about, the practitioners in their early year settings. So there's very important experiences. There's very important capacity building. There's we were talking about safeguarding earlier. There's very important safeguarding. Practitioners are so attuned to the children and families in their care, and they're really important gatekeepers. They're really important protectors. They're really important supporters of families. And there's, it's just that really important space where children can be in the years before they go to primary school, where there's such an important kind of holistic offering for children, not just the education piece. My background is social policy, so I'm really I'm very invested in this idea that in early years we care for children. We don't just educate them, we care for them, and we promote their well-being. So for all those reasons, I think it's so important that we consult with children to get their views, to get their perspectives. And anecdotally, you will hear from the early years sector, children are positive about their experiences.
Yeah, and giving them that voice and that confidence that stays with them through life.
And just to encourage people to have a look at the toolkit that's there now, because there's some really very practical tips and guidance in that toolkit. And, just really sort of informed by the literature and informed by the case studies. And I suppose that the key messages is that, it's for everybody who works with and supports young children. It's not just for people working in the early years sector, but for parents as well, and for anybody who comes across or works with and supports young children. And I think, the good practice examples are there across a range of settings. They look at early years settings, but they look at young children in healthcare, in baby and toddler groups, in the GAA, in their gymnastics clubs, at home. So it's not just early years settings, but obviously, it has huge application to the early years sector. So it's, I think, there's some lovely tips and
lovely.
In very informal language as well, very accessible.
Yeah. No, it's a lovely toolkit.
Yes.
Deirdre, that's a great point to end on. Really enjoyed the chat, and it was so interesting to hear about the research work, and lovely to hear that there's more research starting to happen, and that can only benefit the setting. So I know this is end of May, early June is a really busy time in academia, so I really appreciate you taking the time to come on the podcast today. Thank you so much. And thank you for listening to this episode of Early Childhood Ireland's podcast, which is proudly supported by Aricus Insurance. If you enjoyed it, please press the subscribe button and spread the word to your friends and colleagues, and stay tuned for our next episode.